Hey everyone, it's Mrs. Klosky, and I know you've been waiting since August to develop a graphical user interface, a GUI. We had been doing this in Python from really early on in the course, and I know that now, since we are done with all of the AP content, you'll be excited to learn how GUI works in Java. It'll take a little bit of time to understand all of it. I would highly recommend that you take some time to take a look at chapters 12 and 13 of your book. It's going to give you far more information that I can present in this short presentation, and it gives you a lot of details about the different components. Usually I would assign this reading and give you some questions about it and give you homework on it. But since we are in this remote learning time, I'm just going to trust that you have it there for reference and you'll take a look at it as you need some help developing code related to GUI. All right, so I'm going to give you a little background, but the two classes that we'll import for graphical user interfaces are Swing and AWT. In the earliest versions of Java, the AWT, or the Abstract Windowing Toolkit, were used to create windowing capabilities for GUI. And it was Java's first attempt, but it was problematic. And the reason it was problematic is because if you ran it on different systems, different operating system, it didn't give a consistent look and feel. And so they developed Swing to try to make that more consistent from operating system to operating system. And Swing uses something called components. And a component is simply a way to present data to the user and allow us to interact with the program. So some of the ways that we do that is through something called a J button, Java button, or a label or a text field or something that you are mildly familiar with from how we worked in Python. All right, so a container is just a component. It's a component that holds other components. So what kind of container would hold other components? Well, there are really two. A frame is the one that we will use or inherit from, and we will use that to actually create a window on the screen. And to organize our content, if we have lots of buttons and lots of text fields all in one frame, you might want to create a panel and then add different buttons and text fields and different components to that panel, then add the panel to the frame. That'll be kind of how we organize our visual components. All right, so the JFrame can contain other components like panels, buttons, whatever you want. I would recommend you create your frame, which is your basic window, then create panels, then add components to panels, and add multiple panels to the frame. And we'll do that. We're going to start off really small today and build our skills from small to large over time. All right, so as I mentioned, a JPanel is another container, and it's just a different way to separate and organize layout. We'll use something called a layout manager. There are several. You can read about them in chapters 12 and 13. Again, highly recommended reading for you. Okay. So here's an example of a JFrame. It is basically a window. The window contains what we call a content pane that you can't see, but sometimes you access it. We'll add things to the content area. And a JFrame is our top level container. We can add other components. These are really J labels, J frames, J text fields. The J is missing there. All right. So a JFrame really is a container, which is a component. So you see some inheritance going on there. So you can actually program this close button to be handled any way you want, and I'll show you how to do that. Most of the time, the default way of handling it is just to close the window, but you can lock it and do nothing on close as well. All right. So if you wanted to create a JFrame on its own instead of extend the JFrame class, you would do something that looks like this. We will do something a little bit different to save us some coding time, because all of our projects will extend a JFrame. So it will be a JFrame in itself, so we won't have to declare a JFrame. Here are some pictures, some images of the different components that you can create in Java. There are only a few of them listed here, and I'll make this presentation available so that you can come back and take a look. But in particular, a J slider allows you to just slide this little bar between things. You can have a set of radio buttons, and you'll have to group those radio buttons together so that you can only choose one at a time into something called a J button group. We've got a menu system, spinners, J text fields, and a glorified J text field, which is a J password field. All right, so if you want to set the size of the window, that's how you would do it. Again, if you've extended from the JFrame class, we can just use set size. And likewise, if you want to change how the windows in the upper right-hand corner, how you close the window, that little X, how that's handled, this is how you would do it. This, by default, we're going to use an exit on close, but there are some times where you may want to lock that out and change this constant here, which is really likely just an integer value given a special name because it's in all caps. You can do that as well. I think another one is do nothing on close. To set the frame visible, this is a pretty typical problem. This will either be true or it'll be false. Okay. Generally, a student will come to me and they'll be wondering why nothing is appearing on their screen, but their Java program is still running, and it's because you forgot to set the window visible. Again, if we are extending from JFrame, you can just say set visible true, and that's how I typically program to save some time. In order to add components, you have to use the .add method. So first of all, you'll construct a J button, for example. Okay, you'll set it all up, set all of its properties, and then you'll add it to the JFrame. Okay, it'll go into the JFrame's invisible content frame. And as I mentioned before, you can create something called a JPanel. You can add a bunch of different components to that panel, and then you can add the JPanel to the frame. You can add multiple panels to the frame using what we call a layout manager to make the GUI just look prettier. Okay. Today's example is not going to use a very fancy layout manager. It's just going to use a flow layout, which is basically a nothing layout, but it's very simple to use. So that's how we'll start off today. All right. All of a program is no good unless we can handle events. So we're going to have event-driven applications. So what is an event? You should know that from taking Python, but whenever you interact with the program, code is executed in response to a button click. Or when I touch the screen with my pen and draw you a happy face, there is code behind the scene to respond to my touching of the screen. And that's called an event handler. So the user interacts with the program by interacting with a text field, a slider, or what have you. And that component becomes the source of a listener. So you have to register your components, your buttons, your text fields, any component you like, to listen for events. So once you create the button, it's great, it looks pretty, but it does nothing unless you register a button or a or any component. Now, different components have different types of listeners. So a button adds what we call an action listener to the frame. This would be called the frame. And once you have an action listener set up, it's ready to listen for an event, and then we have to write code to handle the event. Okay, so we have event-driven applications have event handlers, which are methods that respond to the event. So for example, a JButton, back here, we said we registered the button to listen for an event. Once it's registered, it has a handler, and the action perform method would be programmed to handle what happens in response to that event. If you had a slider, it interacts, or excuse me, it has a change event that is coded in order, or it has, and a change event is fired, and we write code in a state changed method. All right, so in summary, you're going to program GUI components, and it's really a four-step process. First, you construct the component. So you declare it, you instantiate it, you set the properties of that button. You then add it to the JFrame, and you set it up to listen for events. After you listen for events, when the program is running, you have to handle the event. And that is either by coding an action performed method, if it's a button, or a state changed method. All right, and you're not going to know what type of method to write until you implement a interface, and it will just pull in the different methods that you have to write in order to handle the event that is fired. All right, it's a little bit crazy. This is all new information. It will take some time to understand, but hang in there. You're doing great. All right, I have a little animation. So here's how this all works. You click a button, right? Once you click that button, an action event is generated. So JButtons throw an action event. Okay, that action event is sent to the action performed method, okay, which we are listening for buttons. It had to be registered using an action listener. Okay, that action performed method has the code to execute in response to the events. And because that action event is past the action performed method, we now have the ability to do some sort of action. And that's how it all works. Okay, so at this point,